Chapter 14, Section 2, American Art and Literature. Um, this chapter is pretty much about all of the cool art and writing and poetry done by people in America during the 1800s. One American Story. As a young man, Washington Irving published articles that made fun of society in the early 1800s. Although he studied to be a lawyer, he eventually made writing his full-time career. Irving wrote some of the first stories to describe America. For example, Rip Van Winkle tells of a man in New York State. Rip wakes up after a 20-year nap to find everything changed. He goes to the inn, which once had a picture of King George on his sign. The red coat was changed from one of blue and buff. A sword was held in its hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. While Rip slept, the Americas had fought and won their revolution. Irving's work helped to win European respect for Americans writing for the first time. This section discusses individuals of the 1800s who created uniquely American literature and art. Writing about America. Irving and other writers were influenced by the style of European art called Romanticism. It stressed the individual and imagination, creativity, and emotion. It drew inspiration from nature. American writers turned their interest to nature into a celebration of the American wilderness. If you remember, at this time, most of the Americans were moving west, where a lot of land was still untouched. So they were seeing beautiful scenes like you see below for the first time. Many books featured the wilderness. James Fenimore Cooper wrote 5 novels about the dramatic adventures of wilderness scout Natty Bumppo. One that remains popular, The Last of the Mohicans, Francis Parkman wrote a travel book, The Oregon Trail, about the frontier trail. In addition, writers began to use more American style. A teacher and a lawyer named Noah Webster gave guidelines to that style in his American Dictionary of the English Language. Webster first published his dictionary in 1828. He later revised it in 1840. The dictionary gave American, not British, spellings and included American slang. Other writers besides Irving celebrated America's past. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote many poems that retold stories from history. For example, Paul Revere's Ride depicted the Revolutionary hero's ride to warn of a British attack. Generations of students memorized lines from the poem such as, "One if by land, two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be." Creating American art. European styles continued to influence American artists, but some took these styles in new directions. One group of painters was influenced by Romanticism work near the Hudson River in New York State. Hudson River School artists painted lush natural landscapes. Several members of this school went west for a change of scenery. For example, Albert Bierstadt took several trips to American mountainous west. He produced huge paintings that convey the majesty of American landscape, like you can see right up here. Other artists also went west. John James Audubon came to the United States from France at the age of 18. Traveling across the continent, Audubon sketched the birds and animals of his adopted country. Enslaved African Americans also contributed to American art. They made beautiful baskets, quilts, and pottery. Most of these slaves remained anonymous, but one did not. David Drake worked in a South Carolina pottery factory and signed the pottery he created. He was the only factory worker to do so. Following one's conscience. In the 1840s, Americans took new pride in their emerging culture. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a New England writer, encouraged his pride. He urged Americans to cast off European influence and develop their own beliefs. His advice was to learn about life from self-examination and from nature as well as books. Emerson's student, Henry David Thoreau, followed that advice. In 1845, Thoreau moved to a simple cabin he built by Walden Pond near the town of Concord, Massachusetts. Thoreau furnished it with only a bed, a table, a desk, and 3 chairs. He wrote about his life in the woods in Walden. Thoreau said that people should live by their own individual standards. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. Emerson and Thoreau belonged to a group of thinkers with a new philosophy called Transcendentalism. It taught that the spiritual world is more important than the physical world. It also taught people to find the truth within themselves through a feeling of intuition. Because Thoreau believed in the importance of individual conscience, he urged people not to obey laws they considered unjust. Instead of protesting with violence, they should peacefully refuse to obey laws. This form of protest is called civil disobedience. For example, Thoreau did not want to support the U.S. government, which allowed for slavery and fought the war with Mexico. Instead of paying taxes that helped to finance the war, Thoreau went to jail. Another New England transcendentalist, Margaret Fuller, also called for change. In her magazine, The Dial, and in her book, Women in the 19th Century, Fuller argued for women's rights. Exploring the human heart. Like Thoreau, other writers broke with tradition. In 1855, poet Walt Whitman published Leaves of Grass, a book that changed American poetry. His bold, unrhymed poems raised ordinary people. Emily Dickinson lived in her family's home almost her entire life. She wrote poems on small pieces of paper that she sewed into booklets. Her subjects include God, nature, love, and death. Most of her 1,775 poems were published only after her death. Both Whitman and Dickinson shaped modern poetry by experimenting with language. Fiction writers of the 1800s also shaped American literature. Edgar Allan Poe wrote terrifying tales that influenced today's horror story writers. He also wrote the first detective story, The Murders of the Rue Morgue. Nathaniel Hawthorne depicted love, guilt, and revenge during Puritan times in The Scarlet Letter. The novel shows the harsh judgment without mercy can lead to tragedy. Hawthorne may have learned that lesson from his family history. One of his ancestors condemned people at the Salem's witchcraft trials. Herman Melville won fame by writing thrilling novels about his experience as a sailor. In 1855, Melville published his masterpiece, Moby Dick. This novel tells about a man's destructive desire to kill a white whale. Although the novel was not popular when it was published, it is widely read now. Several movie versions exist. These fiction writers portrayed the harmful effects of cruel actions. Other people thought that individuals could alter societies for good. Section 3 describes those reformers.